Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Today's question is this month's patron pick, and as you can see, the topic that's been requested is triggered abilities that look back in time. Now, for me, someone who cares really deeply, not just about what the rules say, but why and how they're written that way, well, this is a really exciting topic for me, because this has a lot of really interesting stuff that goes along that line of discussion. So, are you ready? Let's get started. So before we get too deep into this, I want to take a look and see exactly what the issue is for why there are specific types of triggered abilities that look back in time at all. And so this is one rule that is related to that question, which is normally objects that exist immediately after an event are checked to see if the event matched any trigger conditions. So that's basically like a general broad strokes overview of how continuous effects and triggered abilities interact, which is immediately after anything happens in the game has to check to see if what just happened matches any trigger conditions for any triggered abilities. And continuous effects that existed at the time, in other words, at the time when the game is checking, that time is used to determine what the trigger conditions are and what the objects involved in the event look like. So immediately after anything happens in the game checks to see if what just happened based on the conditions that existed at that time, match any trigger conditions that exist, and that's how the game decides whether a triggered ability has triggered or not. So imagine how that would interact with this other rule that I have up on screen here, which says that abilities of all other objects, in other words, stuff that isn't an instant or sorcery spell, generally only function while that object is on the battlefield. So let's take a look at some triggered abilities and we'll see how this kind of functions. So if we have something like the Arishan Cleric here, then everything is going to work perfectly fine. So we'll notice that when it enters the battlefield, then immediately after that event happens, the game is going to check to see if there's any triggered abilities that match the trigger condition of when Arishan Cleric enters the battlefield. And hey, guess what? Immediately after this card enters the battlefield, there will be a triggered ability with just that trigger condition on the battlefield, lined up and ready to go. So everything's going to work great, that ability is going to trigger, and you gain 3 life. So now let's take a look at the Anadet Lurker, and it's kind of similar triggered ability, except you notice that there's a little bit of a difference in how this scenario is going to play out. Because immediately after Anadet Lurker is put into a graveyard, when the game is checking to see if there's any triggered abilities on the battlefield, because remember, like we said in the previous slide, generally abilities only work when they're on the battlefield. So when the game is checking to see if there's any triggered abilities on the battlefield that say when Anadet Lurker is put into a graveyard from play, well, of course, no, there's not going to be any triggered abilities on the battlefield after Anadet Lurker has been put into the graveyard. So it's kind of not clear then how triggered abilities of this sort and several other types of triggered abilities would actually function at all, given those two rules that I had on screen on the previous slide. So let's see what the solution to that problem is. And the solution is actually this rule here. If you notice, I have like the 3 little dots here indicating that maybe there's some extra text there. And hey, guess what? There is some extra text here. And the extra text says that some triggered abilities are exceptions to this rule, and the game actually looks back in time to determine if those abilities trigger, using the existence of those abilities and the appearance of objects that were immediately before the event rather than immediately after it. So what types of triggered abilities would this include? Well, as you might have guessed, zone change triggers, certain zone change triggers can look back in time, including leaves the battlefield abilities. So you can see here's a couple of examples of leaves the battlefield triggered abilities. You can see the Clockwork Fox specifically says when this leaves the battlefield. But then you've got like Sprouting Thrynax. This would also be an example. It says when Sprouting Thrynax dies. And depending on like what card you're seeing, like maybe if it's a older version or maybe if it's a version that deals with something that isn't a creature dying, you might see this template instead, which is like when this is put into a graveyard from play, or when some object is put into a graveyard from play. So those are both examples of leave the battlefield abilities. Actually, it turns out that there's actually a specific rule in the CR that spells out exactly what a leaves the battlefield ability is. So we can see here that leaves the battlefield abilities trigger when a permanent moves from the battlefield to another zone. Or also, when a phased-in permanent leaves the game because its owner has left the game. So that also would be considered a leaves the battlefield ability. So these types of abilities are written as, and these are some of the templates, but you can see that it's not limited to those specific templates. So if you see any triggered ability that triggers off of this sort of a condition, that would be considered a leaves the battlefield ability. Except there's actually this one very interesting line, and this is actually very, very important. This is, I think, for me personally, by the way, incidentally, this is one of the last major rules in the comprehensive rules, and by major I mean like comes up in normal gameplay and doesn't require a situation that was cooked up by a judge who's trying to test your rules knowledge. This is one of the last major rules in the comprehensive rules that I actually learned and became familiar with. So this one's got kind of a special place in my heart. But you can see that an ability that triggers when a card is put into a certain zone from anywhere is never treated as a leaves the battlefield ability, even if that actually corresponds to what's happening. So as an example, we have our friend Crawling Sensation. It says whenever one or more land cards are put into your graveyard from anywhere. So that means that if you have some lands that are put into your graveyard, even if those lands are entering the battlefield or entering the graveyard from the battlefield, that would still not count. This triggered ability would not be counted as a leaves the battlefield ability. It would be just considered a normal triggered ability, and it would not look back in time. And the reason it does not look back in time is because an ability that uses the phrase from anywhere does not count as a leaves the battlefield ability, and the special types of triggered abilities that are allowed to look back in time, you have to be in one of those special categories. But if you're not in the leaves the battlefield category or similar, then you would not be getting to have that privilege of getting to look back in time. So we'll talk a little bit more in the future slides about exactly some of the consequences of that being the case. But that is what leaves the battlefield abilities. That is what is meant by leaves the battlefield abilities. Here's another thing that is not a leaves the battlefield trigger. You can see that it says if Darksteel Colossus would be put into a graveyard from anywhere. But in this case, there's actually another reason on top of the fact that it says the words from anywhere why we cannot consider this to be a leaves the battlefield trigger. And the reason is because that this ability of Darksteel Colossus is actually not a triggered ability at all. Recall that a triggered ability needs to use the word at, when, or whenever. So if you look on Darksteel Colossus, you will not see any of those words, and you also will not see any of those words in the comprehensive rules of any ability that is on Darksteel Colossus. And so, because of that, we can say that none of Darksteel Colossus's abilities are triggered abilities. In this case, this is actually a replacement effect. So be careful not to get those confused. It's very similar wording, but it is in fact a completely separate game concept, not related to this discussion whatsoever. So, okay. Getting back to kind of our main thread here, we say that some zone change triggers look back in time. And these are leaves the battlefield abilities, which we just kind of talked about a lot. Abilities that trigger when a card leaves the graveyard. So here's an example of that. We've got the Erebos Titan ability here that triggers when a card leaves an opponent's graveyard. And abilities that trigger when an object that all players can see is put into a hand or library. So here's the example card that I kind of picked for that, which is the Warped Devotion here. So if we think about that, what that means is let's say that someone plays a boomerang or something on the Warped Devotion itself. So would the Warped Devotion player have to discard a card in that case? And so taking a little bit of a jump forward into how these abilities actually work, we can think about immediately after the boomerang has returned Warped Devotion to its owner's hand, there is no ability on the battlefield that says whenever a permanent is returned to a player's hand, that player discards. Now, unfortunately, for the Warped Devotion player, this is a zone change trigger that has the ability to look back in time, as we can see from this rule here. This has an ability that triggers when an object that all players can see is put into a hand. In this case, that object would be Warped Devotion. And so what that means is that this ability here that is on Warped Devotion is one of the special types of triggered abilities that is able to trigger by looking back in time at what the game state was immediately before the trigger event. In other words, immediately before the permanent is returned to a player's hand, and it will base its decision on whether this ability should trigger based on what the conditions were at that time. So immediately before the boomerang returned Warped Devotion to its owner's hand, there was a triggered ability on the battlefield with this ability that says, whenever a permanent is returned to a player's hand, blah, blah, blah. So that means that this triggered ability, because it is able to look back in time, is able to trigger, and that means the Warped Devotion will make you discard a card if it itself is returned to its owner's hand. So that's kind of a cool interaction. Well, maybe not if you're playing Warped Devotion, but that is how it works. So, okay. And that's just one, by the way. There's actually a whole list of all the different types of triggered abilities. So the next type is abilities that trigger when a permanent phases out, look back in time. And this is kind of a pleasant side effect of doing this presentation. As a rules nerd, I do have a special interest in the topic of cards that have their own special rule in the comprehensive rules. And this card here, I believe, seems to fit that, because as far as my research was able to determine, there is no other triggered ability that triggers when a permanent phases out other than this specific ability on the Teferi's Imp. And if you have any if you have any knowledge of some other triggered ability on a different card that could allow this rule to be relevant, then definitely I'd be interested to hear about that in the comments. But yeah, as far as I'm aware, this Teferi's Imp ability here, when it phases out, that's the only triggered ability that triggers when a permanent phases out in all of Magic. So that's kind of interesting. All right, so moving on, the next one would be abilities that trigger specifically when an object becomes unattached, look back in time. Okay, so what that means is, well, basically just like what you see here. This is the only like kind of ability that triggers like that, by the way. There's I think like a handful of cards, like maybe 5-ish cards, and most of them are this exact ability from Grafted Wargear here. I think this one might be the only one that's a little bit different. It says when it becomes unattached, you destroy that permanent instead of sacrificing it. But like other than that, that's basically the only kind of ability that this rule here is referencing. And then we've got abilities that trigger when a player loses control of an object, look back in time. So here is a couple of examples of that. Certainly with the Gust the Scepter here, it makes sense that you would need this triggered ability to be able to look back in time in order to function the way that it's supposed to function. Because otherwise, if you, for example, destroyed the Gust the Scepter, which of course would constitute you losing control of it, then immediately after that event happened, there would be no triggered ability in play that says that you would have to put the cards back into the owner's graveyards. So this ability would not be functioning the way that it's supposed to. However, because it is able to look back in time, then we are not looking at the game state immediately after the Gust the Scepter is destroyed to see if there's any triggered abilities like that. Rather, we check the game state immediately before the Gust the Scepter is destroyed. And of course, at that point, there is a triggered ability that says when you lose control of Gust the Scepter, then you put them back. You also see it on this card here, Ogre Gear Grabber, and some other kind of similar cards to it. As far as I'm aware, this style of triggered ability, like when it's on this kind of a card, it doesn't really necessarily need to be able to look back in time in order to function the way that it's supposed to. Obviously, it does function the way that it's supposed to with it looking back in time, but I'm not sure if abilities like what we see on the Ogre Gear Grabber are actually necessary for that to function. Certainly, if you wanted to come up with a scenario where it would make a difference, I think it would require jumping through a lot of hoops. Certainly, if you're interested in that sort of thing, take a shot at that and leave one in the comments if that's something that strikes your fancy. The next one is abilities that trigger when a spell is countered, look back in time. So, pretty straightforward here. Again, another one of, I think this is the only ability that triggers when a spell is countered. And then another one of abilities that trigger when a player loses the game, look back in time. And again, it's kind of obvious to see why that would be necessary based on the discussion that we had about like all the other types of triggered abilities that look back in time. Why it's necessary that this sort of triggered ability would also need to be able to look back in time. And this one is actually not another singleton. There's actually like a handful of different planes that have abilities that trigger when a player planeswalks away from a plane. They look back in time. Actually, I know barely anything at all about plane chase, so I can't really say comfortably like exactly how this sort of thing works. But you know, I do know that when you planeswalk away from a plane, part of what that means is that this plane here is going away, and it will not have this triggered ability visible to the game anymore. After that happens, you'll have a different plane that's in play instead. So you actually would not have this. So that's the reason why this needs to work this way. If some billionaire out there wants to like have like a plane chase format Grand Prix or something, then maybe I'll have to learn a little bit more about how these things work. But I guess until that time, I've gotten pretty far without knowing. So okay, and then there actually is no more types of triggered abilities that look back in time. That list of ones that we just went over, that's all of them. And so with that being the case, now I thought maybe we could come up with some like challenge questions where we talk about you know, exactly how those triggered abilities work. So the first one is kind of like a classic. I think a lot of people have like kind of seen or heard of this kind of triggered ability question before. But the idea is like you've got your Damnation and you've got your Midnight Reaper, and then, you know, maybe you've got like some more non-token creatures, like you have like some Grizzly Bears or something in play. And you play the Damnation, what happens? Which creatures dying would cause the Midnight Reaper to trigger, if any? So you can see the ability says whenever a non-token creature you control dies, then Midnight Reaper deals 1 damage to you and you draw a card. So what that means is, because we have a dies trigger, that is in fact a leaves the battlefield trigger. It triggers when something moves from the out of the battlefield. So this would in fact be one of those special types of triggered abilities that is able to look back in time. And as such, we have identified that type of triggered ability is what we're dealing with. And we've also identified that the game event that is probably going to cause this triggered ability to trigger would be all creatures getting destroyed. So the cool thing is all the creatures get destroyed at the exact same time. So the game event is when all of the creatures are destroyed. Not when Midnight Reaper itself gets destroyed, or not when Grizzly Bear specifically gets destroyed. It's when all of the creatures get destroyed. And so that means immediately before that game event, because remember, this special type of triggered ability allows us to look back in time. So we're looking at the game state immediately before that event happened. And so immediately before the Damnation has destroyed all creatures, well, guess what? There was a creature in play with the triggered ability when a non-token creature you control dies. And yeah, that did happen. That happened for the Midnight Reaper. It happened for your Grizzly Bears. It happened for any other creatures you might happen to control. And so the Midnight Reaper will be triggering, and each of the things that died is going to be one instance of a non-token creature you control dies. So guess what? You get one instance of you draw a card and take 1 damage for each creature that you had in play, including the Midnight Reaper itself. So that is the way that this situation would work. Now, of course, one other kind of interesting fact about this would be that, like we said before, continuous effects that existed at that time are also going to be taken into account when deciding what the characteristics of objects are. So that means if you had something like this Nature's Revolt in play at the time when you played this Damnation, well, all lands are going to be 2/2 creatures that are still lands. And so that means that continuous effect is going to be applying to all of the lands you control when the Damnation destroys them. And so also, immediately before the Damnation has destroyed all creatures, the Midnight Reaper is checking to see if any of the stuff that's happened matches what happens for its trigger condition. By gosh, yes it did. So all of the lands at the time when we're checking were creatures. It doesn't matter that after they have been destroyed by Damnation and they're in the graveyard now, they stopped being creatures. It matters that immediately before the event that caused this trigger to trigger is going, we're going to see that those lands were indeed creatures. And so that means that this ability will trigger once for each land that you control. This would also kind of work the same exact way if Nature's Revolt itself were a creature. So if for example, there were like some creature And I'm sure there's a creature like this out there in Magic's history somewhere that was just like a random creature that had an ability like this where all your lands are 2/2 creatures that are still lands. So if there was a creature like that in play when the damnation happened, then hey, guess what? Same thing. Because even though that creature has died, all of the triggers from the Midnight Reaper are going to look back in time. And so immediately before the damnation has killed all of the creatures, including the one that's making all your lands into creatures, immediately before that happened, then all your stuff was a creature. And so that would also mean that the answer would not change whatsoever if the Nature's Revolt itself were a creature, or if it was an actual enchantment like we have in this question that we proposed. So okay, that is that. Next kind of interesting challenge question. So like for this scenario, we're going to say that Nick has a Grafted wargear, and that Grafted wargear is attached to Nick's grizzly bears, and then Amy is going to threaten the grizzly bears, and then after that resolves, we're going to play like a bounce spell, like a boomerang, against the Grafted wargear. What will happen in that case? So we talked about this before, that the Grafted wargear becoming unattached from a creature, becomes unattached from a creature is in fact a type of triggered ability that is able to look back in time. And so that is exactly what the Grafted wargear triggered ability is going to do. So immediately before the boomerang returned Grafted wargear to its owner's hand, then there was a ability in play that said whenever Grafted wargear becomes unattached from a creature, you sacrifice that creature. So guess what? That means that the Grafted wargear's ability is going to trigger. And here's the interesting part. So this is the reason, by the way, why like if the Grafted wargear gets destroyed, or if the Grafted wargear gets returned to your hand, or anything like that happens, that's the reason why the creature would get sacrificed under normal conditions. And I say that under normal conditions because actually, if you notice, the person who's being instructed to sacrifice that creature is the Grafted wargear's controller. So we say that was Nick, who controlled the Grafted wargear. But Amy is the person who controls the grizzly bears that's attached to it at the time when this happens. Because remember, Amy threatened the grizzly bears. So actually, it is not legal for you to sacrifice a creature unless it is a creature you control. So because Nick does not control the grizzly bears at the time that he is instructed to sacrifice it, that part will actually not happen and the grizzly bears will live. So that worked out pretty well for Nick. A lot better than if, for example, he had a captain's hook. Because, of course, the captain hook just says to destroy that permanent. And so there's no such rule that says you cannot destroy a permanent you don't control. So actually, if we had the exact same setup, but it was a captain's hook instead of the Grafted wargear, then Nick would, in fact, be instructed to destroy the grizzly bears that he owns. And unlike in the previous scenario, that would not be a problem. So he would do that, and that would work exactly the way that it normally would. So that's kind of an interesting thing, and I feel like that's probably why this one uses the word destroy, because situations like that are a little bit less clear if we're having you sacrifice it, even if it's a little bit more like probably flavorfully appropriate for what's actually happening in the game. So, okay, great. And now we've got another one. And I thought this was a really cool question. I just came up with this one a short time before this is one of the last minute ones that I was ready to go with this presentation. And then I thought of this question. I was like, wow, we cannot go to air without this question. This is such a sweet question. So, okay, the idea is we have the Desecrated Tomb. And then, of course, like our graveyard has like some creature cards in it. And then someone plays the Decree of Annihilation, which says we remove all artifacts and graveyards and then some other stuff from the game. So, of course, the question is, would we generate a bat token from this happening? So, what do you think? So, again, we can remember that this Desecrated Tomb, it does have one of those special types of triggered abilities. In this case, the special ability is a zone change trigger that relies on a card leaving a graveyard. So that, in fact, does mean that the Desecrated Tomb has a triggered ability that is special. It gets to look at the game state immediately before the game event. causes the cards to leave your graveyard. So, okay. Now let's take a look at the Decree of Annihilation, and we'll notice something kind of interesting about that, which is that it just uses the one verb in order to describe what's getting exiled. So it says remove all artifacts, creatures, lands, from the game. So we just have one word, and if you look in the Oracle text, it'll say exile. So because there is only one action word that corresponds to what we're doing, that means that we're not exiling all of this stuff in a sequence. We're not exiling the artifacts first, and then the creatures, and then the lands. Actually, what happens is we're going to take all of the stuff that's getting exiled, and then we're going to exile all at once, all in one game action. And of course, that's very important for the discussion that we have here. And in general, it's pretty important for like discussions involving triggered abilities. But specifically related to this one here, it's very important for getting the right answer, because what it means is that all of the stuff is getting exiled at the same time. So when the game is checking to see what happened immediately before, like what the game state was looking like immediately before the game event that caused one or more creature cards to leave a graveyard, the game will see that immediately before that event happened, the Desecrated Tomb was still on the battlefield. Because again, it gets exiled at the exact same time as all of the stuff from your graveyard. And so what that means is immediately before the stuff from your graveyard got exiled, the Desecrated Tomb was on the battlefield, and the game does get to see that it had that triggered ability on the battlefield immediately before that game event happened. So you would, in fact, get the bat token. Let's also remember a fact about how timing and priority works in Magic. We do not put any triggered abilities on the stack until after the spell has finished resolving. So that means that even though all creatures are getting removed, the bat token is not going to be in play at the same time as all the other stuff is getting removed. And so that means the trigger that gives you the bat token will not be able to resolve until after the Decree of Annihilation is all the way done resolving. So you will actually end up getting the bat token in that specific situation. So that's pretty cool. Now, the really cool part would be if we had this other card. Like, so here's an example with Farewell. So if you see Farewell, it does the same sort of thing. Of course, we're going to say that we're like doing the like exile all artifacts and all graveyards modes, right? But you see there's one very important difference from the previous case, which is that unlike Decree of Annihilation, Farewell actually has multiple verbs here. So what's actually going to happen is first, we are going to exile all artifacts, and then after that, we're going to exile all graveyards. So there's two different game instructions that are happening here. And so what that means is that first, we will exile all artifacts, including the Desecrated Tomb, and then after that, we will exile all graveyards. And immediately before the event of your graveyard getting exiled, the game is going to check to see if there's any triggered abilities that might interact with that event, and guess there's not, because at that time, that's after all artifacts have been exiled. So the Desecrated Tomb is no longer around to give you that triggered ability. So you, in fact, would not get a bat token if you use the Farewell this way. So, of course, maybe we can think about like what might happen if we had like some kind of hypothetical reverse Farewell, right? So like the exact same card as Farewell, but like the modes are written in the opposite order. So if we had that card, if that random card existed, then we would be exiling all graveyards first. And so, of course, the Desecrated Tomb still would be in play at that point. So that triggered ability would trigger. And then only after that would you exile all artifacts. So you would get the bat in the case that you had like a reverse Farewell with the modes in the opposite order. And again, with the discussion that we had previously, even if the reverse Farewell had chosen to exile all creatures, the triggered ability doesn't even get put on the stack until all of the instructions on Farewell have finished happening. And so that means that even with the reverse Farewell, you would still get the bat token. So there's that. And then so you can use this last one as kind of a way to check your understanding here. So we've got the Scrap Mastery, and same setup as before. For this one, we're going to have to assume that like one of the cards in your graveyard is an artifact creature, because you know this is only like for creature cards and this is for like artifact cards. So, but yeah, we'll say that we have an artifact creature of some sort in our graveyard while this is going on. So what do you think? Would you get the bat token here or not? And so again, we're going to do the exact same thing. We're going to carefully look at the card, and we'll notice that it says first, each player exiles all artifact cards from their graveyard. So that's one action word. Is we have the word exile here. Then after that, you sacrifice all the artifacts you control. So you can see that you actually exile the cards from your graveyard first, and then after that happens, you sacrifice the Desecrated Tomb. So because of the sequence that these are written in, you actually do get the bat token based on the fact that you exile the cards from your graveyard first, and then you sacrifice all the artifacts you control. So notice another kind of interesting thing. This is kind of a little bit off of the topic of looking back in time, because for this specific example, the Scrap Mastery, it doesn't really matter if we look back in time or if we look at the game state immediately after the trigger condition happens the way we normally do for normal triggered abilities. In either case, the Desecrated Tomb trigger would be happening, because in either of those cases, the Desecrated Tomb, both before and after the trigger event happens of cards getting exiled from your graveyard, in both of those cases, the Desecrated Tomb triggered ability does exist on the battlefield, both immediately before and immediately after those cards get exiled from your graveyard. So in this specific case, it actually doesn't matter that this triggered ability looks back in time. But for some of the other questions that preceded this one, it definitely does. Specifically the Decree of Annihilation one, it definitely does matter that you're able to look back in time. So yeah, that's kind of a fun question. I was really happy with this one. So I like that one. And then there's actually one other one, and this is one of my favorite ones. You might even say this is a Judge Vault question. But the idea is, of course, you have like the clone, and it's a copy of the World Spine Worm, and then the clone dies, is put into a graveyard from the battlefield. Which of these triggered abilities will trigger? So you notice the World Spine Worm has one that gives you 3/5/5 worm tokens, and you have one that shuffles it into its owner's library. So is the clone shuffled into its owner's library, and does the clone player get 5 worm tokens? 3 worm tokens, sorry. So with that discussion, we can see that we'll take a look at the first one here. So it says when World Spine Worm dies, you put 3 worm tokens into play. So guess what? This is a dies trigger. That means that the game checks what the game state looks like immediately before that trigger event happens, and immediately before the World Spine Worm / clone was put into the graveyard from the battlefield, which is what dies means. Immediately before that event happened, we did have a card on the battlefield that says when that event happens, you get some tokens. So yes, you do in fact get the 5 worm tokens when the clone dies. Now the kind of weird thing is that you do not shuffle the clone into its owner's library. And the reason for that is because, remember, if we see these magical words from anywhere on the trigger, then that means that it is not triggered. That trigger is not treated as a leaves the battlefield trigger, even though it might otherwise seem like it should be. So even though this has the exact same thing as its trigger condition, that being the World Spine Worm being put into the graveyard, in this case from the battlefield. So even though the exact same thing is causing both of those two triggered abilities to trigger, only one is going to actually trigger for the clone / World Spine Worm. And that's because immediately after the event of clone getting put into the graveyard, the game does not see that there is a triggered ability of the sort that exists. So these types of triggered abilities can trigger from the graveyard. So they're an exception to the first rule that we saw on the first slide. So that means that specific type of triggered ability does have the ability to function from the graveyard. And that's the exceptional thing that happens that makes triggered abilities of this sort work. It's kind of a little bit weird when you think about it, but I really like this question as a showcase of what the difference between these two is. So yeah, if you have a normal World Spine Worm, then of course both of these things are going to happen when it dies. But if you clone a World Spine Worm, you would only get the worm tokens, and you would not shuffle it into its owner's library. And so that's all of the questions that I had come up with today. There's only one thing that I wanted to talk about in addition to that, and that is thank you so much to all of my patrons. I'm so grateful to all of you. You have no idea. this was a really awesome topic. I really liked getting to do the research for this one, and so definitely I'm super grateful that y'all picked me out a really excellent topic this month, and I'm super grateful for all of your continued support. But that is all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again next time for another daily ruling. But until then, I hope you have a great day.